The next city we're going to speak about is Tikal, or what's called the Place of the Voices. Now, why is it called the Place of the Voices? Well, as you're walking along the paths here, you can actually hear the various animals, right, that inhabit the jungle here. This is a very jungly area, right? This is in Guatemala. And you can hear all these animals, right, that are out in the forest. And the people who lived here at the time could hear them too. So they called it the place of the voices. When we were walking here, I actually heard monkeys, right, in the trees brachiating. And our guide actually thought he heard a jaguar off in the forest. He actually stopped us and was kind of like, "Let's wait a minute. Let's make sure this jaguar goes off somewhere, until we're safe." And that's when he told us the story actually about the jaguars, and how they were the protectors of the sun. And so the idea that the jaguar, he eats the sun at night, right? He protects the sun in his belly until the next morning, where he basically vomits it back up like a hairball, I guess you'd say. And that's the reason why Mayans said that cats' eyes shine at night, is that they have the sun in their belly, basically. So that's why they have shiny eyes when you see them at night, right? So again, it's just a fun story about, the mythology of the sun rising and setting and the relationship to cats, right, and their power amongst the Mayan people. Tikal was a huge city. It covered about 25 square miles and had about a population of about 100,000, we think. Which, if you think, about the size of Tallahassee, which is a little over 200,000 now, kind of encroaching perhaps onto 250, 300 probably in the next couple years. But if you think this is, basically like a city that was half the size of our city, that's a pretty big city for this time, especially, right? So it was a pretty big place. And again, just like Copan, you see it set up around these open courtyards or squares with monuments around them. Notice that here, this is a very flat area, right? So you'll notice that the monuments are going to be taller, right? They're going to be more elevated, unlike Copan, which was at a higher elevation. Probably the most famous temple at Tikal is the Temple of the Giant Jaguar, and it is related to the leader, Lord Sky God K. And again, we're translating these kind of Mayan glyphs, right, into what we think is English. So this one translates into the idea of something related to the sky, and then this weird letter kind of thrown in there too. So he was known as Lord. He's known to us as Lord Sky God K. So this is his burial place. He was buried underneath the monument, not inside of the monument, but underneath the monument, right? And the reason why we think that was done is because of the Mayan belief in what we call Shababa, or the underworld. So their belief is that you pass through, right, to the underworld. And I'd mentioned that the underworld was often thought of as like a cave, right? You passed into and you passed into another space. So they would bury their people underneath things or in the ground because again, that was thought to be a link to the underworld or a link to the idea of Shabalba, right? And if you look at how they deal with the idea of the world of the living, right, the world of the underworld, right, the world of the gods, it's always this idea of layers. So I'll show you another diagram of this idea of layering space, right? And so they talked about how there's often layers within these spaces as well. And so for them, the underworld had 9 layers. Well, if you count up the levels of the pyramid, you'll notice that there's 9. So the temple symbolically relates to this idea of the underworld or the world of the dead in a sense, if you think about it this way. So it has this stepped kind of appearance to it, but again, it's using numerology that the Mayans were interested in relating itself to the underworld. You'll note that you're passing up through the pyramid. In the top, you'd have a temple, right, where the priests, the religious figures would do, sort of various rituals, right? We'll talk about the idea of blood sacrifice, right? Autonomous blood sacrifice and such, right? That's where these events would take place. And so the pyramids, in a sense, would have been a very visible place for people to see ceremony or to see, again, the idea of their leader being buried, right, and memorialized. And so, again, these are important monuments for the Mayans. And notice, again, very tall because, again, it's a very flat place that we're looking at here. If you go today, right, you're not allowed to walk up these pyramids, right? But when you are allowed to ascend some of the pyramids, you'll notice there's these usually staircases built into the sides of them, and you would take that to the top. The Temple of the Giant Jaguar, you're not allowed to climb on because, again, it's just a very valuable monument. And again, if you do climb monuments, this is normally how you do it now. You don't actually take the real staircases up and down anymore. you take these wooden staircases that are sort of affixed to the side of a monument. When you get to the top of here at Tikal, you can notice how big Tikal really is by looking out and seeing all the other monuments off in the distance. You can get a sense of how flat it is here and how truly they were building these mountains in a sense. Why build these mountains? Well, they're symbolic. They connect to the gods, right, in the heavens in a sense. But also, they were practical watchtowers to look out and see if any enemies were coming and prepare right for that. So we think these are symbolic to their religious ideals, but also at the same time, we're very practical in function for them to protect themselves right in times of need. Now, at Tikal, you can see different types of imagery related to fertility and other symbolism. So I like using Tikal as a place to talk about some of the subsidiary monuments that you might see and how they function as far as Mayan beliefs. So fertility is a really important thing amongst the Mayans, and you see it depicted using different imagery, but especially what we call the world tree imagery. Now, the world tree, is related to fertility, and I'd also mention the maize god that you're seeing here, and this idea of fertility through food. So here with the maize god, you'll notice he has this headdress on that looks like a stalk of corn, essentially, because maize is, a corn family, related object, food object. And so you'll notice his headdress kind of looks like a stalk, right, coming up out of his head. So this idea of fertility, how do you show it, right? The maize god also referred to that. But the world tree is sort of seen throughout a lot of the imagery. Um, One of the famous ways you see the world tree depicted is with Lord Pakal's, I guess we call it sarcophagus, from a different site called Palenque. Now, we're not going to go to Palenque and look at any of their monuments, but I do like showing you Lord Pakal's sarcophagus. If you look at it, you'll notice you have Lord Pakal here in the center and the world tree kind of exploding out of him. This, of course, is hard to read like a lot of the stone carved monuments are. So, of course, I have a diagram that kind of breaks that down. The world tree is often thought of as the diagram of the Mayan universe with three sections, right? The world of the gods at the top, the world we inhabit, right? And then the world of the underworld below. So, this idea of like three sections essentially the gods, us, the underworld. And with the call image, you'll notice there's almost this idea of the world tree kind of exploding out of him, right? That the people, the Mayan people, in a sense, had to provide fertility, but they're linked to the cosmos, right? They're linked to the greater things that help organize the world around them. And a lot of the cosmology, plays into this as well, where many people say that some of the imagery is related to like the stars in the heavens, right? The Big Dipper, the Milky Way, right? Different types of things. The world tree actually has correlation to a real tree, which is the ceiba tree. So if you're in Guatemala, right, Honduras, and you see this tree, this is the tree that the Mayans were looking at and saying was their world tree, right? So again, fertility imagery is often embedded, right, in Mayan thinking. I also want to show you the city of Bonampak, which is the last of the three early cities I'll show you. And Bonampak is unique because it's related to blood and the sort of a revisionment of how a lot of Mayanists looked at blood. I've never personally been to Bonampak. It's actually quite hard to travel here and hard to get here, so maybe someday I will, but it's a little bit harder of a Mayan site to go see. It's not very large in comparison to a lot of the other sites, and it's just not as touristed because of its location. And this is why, for a long, long time, Mayanists and archaeologists had not really seen Bonampak and not known much about it. It actually was discovered by Giles Healy at the beginning of the 20th century when some Mayans were like, Mayan descendants were like, we kind of have a secret out in the forest. You want to go see it, out in the jungle? And he was like, okay, and so he goes off with them and he finds this whole city that no one has ever known about. And the reason why no one really knew about it is because we think that, it was a smaller city. It wasn't really very important to Mayan culture. But when you go there, you find this imagery that really changed the perception of who the Mayans were. And most of it revolved around bloodshed. Now, most of what we know about the Mayans, as I mentioned, is they use blood in a very directed way. What I mean about that is that they're not wasteful, they're not violent, right? They don't just kill people for no reason. They actually were usually practitioners of what we call auto sacrifice, right? This sense of using your own blood to advance your culture. This was something that was done usually by the kings and the queens, the rulers. I use king and queen because it's a word we know. We don't know what they called their rulers, right? But the people in charge, this is what they normally did. For men, on the right, you'll notice he's holding kind of the sharp instrument down towards his genitalia. Men would pierce their penises and bleed onto papers, and then they would burn the papers as offerings to the gods. The idea that you, as the ruler, you were giving up sacred blood from yourself and from, a very sensitive area, right? So they'd pierce their penises, bleed onto the papers, and then burn the papers, right, as this sort of offering to the gods. Women, you'll notice, they'd pierce their tongues and then they'd run these cords through them made out of this natural material, this natural fiber that had like thorns in it. So they'd run the cord through the tongue, right? And then they'd bleed onto the paper and the same kind of thing. They'd burn it as an offering. This is auto sacrifice. This is you taking your body, damaging it symbolically, right, to offer your blood for others, right? So this is auto sacrifice. And again, you'll see some other imagery related to this here with the ruler standing, right, and the woman kneeling with the cord in her mouth, bleeding onto the paper, right? So, again, this was very symbolic, right? It was about your role as a ruler and how you'd protect your people and provide for your people, right? And they really truly believe that blood controlled the universe. So will the Aztec. But again, with the Mayans, they thought it should be a very directed thing. It should be done by very few people, right? And this is sort of what people understood about the Maya. When Giles Healy showed up at Bonaparte and saw these murals, they really changed a lot of what we knew about the Maya. If you go back and look at like real old books about the Maya, like go find some old published books, like, 1910, 1920, 1930, you'll find them talking about the Maya as that they are peaceful, artistic people, right? No blood, no nothing, right? And when Giles Healy found this, people were like, "What? Oh my god, like this is not who the Mayan are." And people tried to resist it. But what we saw at Bonaparte is that sometimes they would use larger scale blood ritual for a specific purpose, right? So in this imagery, you'll notice you have the leader in the center, his subordinates over here, and then people that appear to be sacrificed, right, or being tortured, right, to use their blood. This guy here, for instance, has his fingernails pulled out, right? This guy had his heart ripped out. And so, this idea of this sort of blood ritual writ large in this mural, people were like, what in the heck, right, am I seeing? So, you have Chan Muan, or as we call him, Lord Mythological Skybird. You gotta love these names, right? And him with the people in front of him that are being sacrificed. Now, the way the Mayans read this is these must have been another tribe, again, like Toltecs or somebody else, mixed texts, but not Mayans, and that their blood is being used in a very specific purpose. Also, notice that they're wearing jaguar skins, right? So this idea of wearing feline skins as symbols of power, this is also something to note in the imagery. Um, and again, these people had their hearts ripped out, right? They had their fingernails pulled out and they're bleeding, right? So again, this was imagery that really changed how people saw the Maya. I actually read a really old text where one of the people was trying to say, oh, that these people dipped their hands in paint and they were going to make murals, right? They're going to paint murals, and so the paint was dripping off their hands. Never underestimate our ability to kid ourselves if information doesn't suit our needs, right? I've seen this more than I'd like to say, even amongst really smart scholars, where it's like, that guy is not dripping paint. He's had his fingernails ripped out, he's bleeding. So, again, usually when we see the Maya use blood, it's very focused, it's very directed. But here, this was something that people didn't expect to see. And it really, again, shifted the perception that sometimes perhaps the Maya did do this. And maybe later, this is where the Aztecs got the idea from, right? These sort of early glimmerings of larger scale blood usage, right, by the Maya.